Welcome to episode 3. It is a grey but dry day in September in Fife, and we're just out walking down to the sea. It's sort of starting to get a bit chilly, but I'm still only wearing a jumper, so I feel thankful for that. And I don't have a jacket on. It's not raining, so let's just take the winds where we can get them. This week's guest is just a really interesting and engaging. She just has an interesting and engaging brain. It is Ginny Yurich, and I stumbled across her maybe quite a few years ago, when my kids were very small, and I was looking for ideas of how to kind of get them outside and teach them more about the natural world around them. My mum is a gardener and sort of one of those people that knows a lot about the natural world, and my dad was a farmer, so also knows a lot. And I think I have internalized some of that, but I've never been very good at all the names of things and remembering the details, so I kind of wanted to go back and try and make myself learn those things and get my kids out. So I found 1000 Hours Outside, and on Ginny's website they just have this whole backlog of resources into anything that you think your child might be interested in nature, and she will have a kind of resource for you that you can, if they're into squirrels, you can use that as your segue in. If they're into just sort of hitting stuff, which my kids are into, sort of hitting things with wood and stuff, you can go in, and she's got loads on different kinds of trees and how to identify them. And then she also has this challenge called the 1000 Hours Outside Challenge, which we talk about a little bit, but I found it a really useful framework when my kids were young, and I found it really hard. It's just a weird time. It's a very short time. It's a very weird and quite lonely time. And I find it really useful to have a kind of framework that I was aiming for, which is 1000 hours outside. We didn't make it to 1000 hours outside, but I find it really useful as a kind of, right, what we're going to do, we're just going to go out and not really do anything. We're just going to go out and be in the woods, and the kids will kind of make their own games. So I really wanted to speak to Ginny Yurich about how she started, where she is now, and I know that her kids are teenagers now, and I'm kind of interested to know how that shift is going, and if they're still spending lots of time outside. Ginny has an astonishing brain, a bit like Andrew's, in that she can read and retain a huge amount of information. So she is a kind of just a whole vault of resources when you speak to her. We could have gone on for hours and hours. But I really hope you enjoy this chat. We had an absolute blast, and I've put some links below to some of her resources. And if you've got children, or you've got friends with kids, and you're kind of thinking about getting outside more, even actually just using that framework as 1000 hours outside, and whether that's something that we could kind of, as adults, try and aim for, it just makes you reframe your day a little bit and think, actually, how can I get an extra 10 minutes here or there, regardless of the weather, and just spend it outside. And she talks about, in her case, she said the easiest thing they did was leaving a little bit earlier for school, or eating outside even in the winter. And she lives way far north, up towards the Canadian border, so I imagine it gets pretty cold there. So weather's not the big barrier. She's just managed to carve out a life that involves a lot of nature. Anyway, I could go on and on and on. Let's get chatting with Ginny, and check out the show notes below, and let us know what you think.
How to stand on shifting sand, how to bend but stay intact.
Hello. Hi. Hey everyone, we are here with Ginny Yurich from 1000 Hours Outside. I've got Andrew here, as
Hiya.
ever. Ginny, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. Congrats on your podcast. This is so exciting.
Thank you very much. I first heard of 1000 Hours Outside Challenge a few years ago. I guess I came across you on Instagram. I think some friends of mine recommended it, and it was just like a long, cold, and very damp UK winter, as we seem to be dealing with these days. And it was really nice to have, for me, it was really nice to have some structure. My kids were quite little. I think they were maybe 4 and 2, so I felt like I was getting a bit more sleep, but still kind of on the edge. And I just like the idea of having a reason to go outside with my friends and my kids as well. So thank you for providing those resources. But for those of our listeners that haven't heard of the 1000 Hours Outside podcast and challenge, maybe you could give us a little bit of background about like why you started it and kind of where it's come from and how it's morphed over time.
Yes. I've been around for a while, Jill. I mean, it's been quite a long time. And the story is not that I am some outdoorsy person. The story is really that I was a crummy mom. A crummy mum. Is that how you would say it there?
Yeah.
Crummy mum. I struggled, when our kids were small, and I struggled with knowing how to utilize the time, how to pass the day, basically. And I think culturally, and I'm not sure if it's the same, but I bet it's probably somewhat similar. Culturally, when I looked around, what people were doing was they were enrolling their kids in classes, and that was both expensive and irritating. Who wants to take their kid to a
Yeah.
45-minute class? They don't want to go. You're going to take your kid to this library thing, or you're going to take them to music and moms and or whatever the program was.
Yeah.
And we had a couple kids. I'm like, we're running out of money. And you would take your kid and it would be finagling them there and all your stuff and the diaper bags for not much of a payout. And in fact, was it swim lessons? I mean, and then the one who's in the pool doesn't want to be in the pool, and the one who you're holding wants to be in, and everyone's crying. And I would feel like by 11 a.m., most days of all days of mothering, really, I felt like I was toast. I'm done. And my husband worked out of the home at that time. This is like, because I'm old, this is like way pre COVID. And he would be gone for 10 hours. You've got to commute and there's lunch. And so I would think, like, I have 8 more hours to go. It's like a full day with these kids. And I was exhausted and I wasn't enjoying it. I was excited to be a mom and then was really struggling with the sort of day to day of it. And I felt like a failure all the time. And I had a friend who did this program called MOPS, which is an international program. They've changed their name to MOMCO, but it's a program where it's, if you've got little kids, you go once every other week. And usually there's a childcare component and you get to make some friends. And it was a really big lifeline for me, even though my kids wouldn't go in the childcare program. But it was fine. I'll sit at this table, I'll bounce my kids. They're crying. It's okay. I'm making a couple friends. And I had a mom who said one sentence that really changed my entire life. And I always think that's a message of hope because you could be in a bad spot and who knows when your sentence is going to come. And the sentence was Charlotte Mason says that kids should be outside for 4 to 6 hours whenever the weather is tolerable. And I thought, that's absurd. That's what I thought. I've never heard of that. And I didn't learn until many years later, actually, that Charlotte Mason was from the 1800s. So I thought that was an important tidbit of information that my friend should have given, but she did not. And so I'm thinking, I know some Charlottes. This seems current. And and she asked me if I wanted to try it. And I thought, surely no, this is an awful idea. Who wants to do anything with a kid for 4 to 6 hours? They're going to cry and fuss. What are they going to do? I'm like, have you been to this program? Like they don't like it. It's 45 minutes. It's a terror. And I thought, well, this is not going to go well. And but I didn't say any of that because I was like also desperately wanting friends. So I was like, okay, yeah, I'll come. And her big thing was like, you're not supposed to bring toys. And I'm like, well, what are they going to do? Should I bring a craft kit, or books? What can I do? Like, I could bring all our action figures. And she was like, no, we don't bring anything. Just bring food and a picnic blanket. And so back in September of 2011, that's been well over a decade when
Wow.
all I had were toddlers and preschoolers and babies, little kids 3 and under. I had I call it the best day of my life because it was the first good day I had as a mom. I'd not had a good day yet. And we met at this park from 9 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon. It was the fall. We're in Michigan in the
Mm.
US, and in Michigan in the fall it's beautiful. It was September. It was like a, blue skies day, cool, sunny, and the kids just played. And I was there with a friend, and she had two little kids that were running around, and I had two little kids that were running around. We each had a baby. The babies would nurse and nap and lay on the picnic blanket and look at the trees and that type of thing. And it was the first day that I felt like I enjoyed it, and I got to have my blood pressure drop a little bit, and the kids had a great time. And then we left and everyone fell asleep in the car. We were there from 9 in the morning till 1 in the afternoon. They all fell asleep at the same time. I was like, this is a miracle. And so we really changed how we were doing early childhood immediately. It was a completely different experience to be outside for that length of time. I'd never heard of that. And what I noticed very quickly was, beyond myself feeling better, all of a sudden the kids were thriving. And so they're eating better, sleeping better, playing better when they're inside. In fact, we've hardly had any doctor's appointments since 2011 for anything acute. We've had one case of pink eye that we had to go to the eye doctor for. That's it. So the kids, just their health improved. And it's been a journey for me, a 12-year one, of learning that when we let our kids play outside and we don't have to organize any of the things, we can, but we don't have to. When we allow our kids to play outside freely, it enhances every facet of their development. So we're talking obviously their physical development, but also emotional, social, and their their cognitive development. I mean, this is school. This is a learning.
Mhm.
And it helps the parent too. So it's just been something that we've been implementing since we named it in 2013, based off of research at the time that said kids were on screens for 4 to 7 hours a day, but only playing outside for 4 to 7 minutes. That was a US stat. And it's actually probably gotten worse. There's a lot of disparity there. So
Oh,
four to
that is
seven minutes
mind
versus four to
blowing.
7 hours. And we thought, well, this is about the amount of time we've been playing outside, based off of Charlotte Mason. Angela Hanscom has a book called Balanced and Barefoot. She's a pediatric occupational therapist who echoes a similar number, like about an average of 3 hours a day. And doing this, and we've been doing it now, we have teens, has changed our entire life. I think this simple concept of prioritizing nature play, which people thought was a weird idea for a very long time,
Yeah.
but this concept of prioritizing nature play answers a lot of modern day parenting problems.
Yes.
It's so true, but it's funny, isn't it? Because it feels like it's a what people might have thought was weird in terms of like getting the kids outside. I mean, in the UK, we like the kind of the Victorians. Victorians were doing it,
Yeah.
like sort of before we created all of this technology. The kids were outside like all of the time, and
Yeah.
no one had any idea where they were mostly.
I think it was Alison Gopnik who, in her book, she does a search, in the history of using the word parenting, like parenting as a verb, to parent. And she looks where, like, even this idea of actively parenting just didn't really explode, until whatever, the late 80s, early 90s. Obviously people weren't Googling parenting in the 1800s, but just looking at it in books and things.
Or
But
in the 1980s.
yeah, or the
One of the
1980s,
1980s, that's right.
or yeah, I mean, whatever, Google came around like 96, 97. But like, it's so funny where there's like this pressure to do this active parenting all the time, where like, where the sentence that I had that changed, I think it was your mom, Jill, who, I think she said something along the lines of, the more you entertain kids, the more they need to be entertained. And kids just sort of almost need to learn to kind of play, to give them that space. And I think it's interesting. And I think one of the things we can talk about today is the differences between what's happening in the UK and the US, because all this idea of kids being outside and giving them freedom, and the free range parenting and all this sort of thing, it's become so much more understandable now than it was 10 years ago. I mean, you starting this in, well, more than 10 years ago, 2011, this was a really new idea. And I think if you talk to people now, more people have cottoned down onto it, you know? But then I think that there has almost been this, it's not fair to call them a lost generation. And obviously it's kind of different on different backgrounds and class levels and things. But you see that, like, the kids who were growing up 10 years ago, the parents were much more free with mobile phones and things now. And I think it's just become apparent to people that maybe we shouldn't have given the kids all the screens, and maybe they shouldn't have all had, mobile phones when they were 8. And it's not evenly distributed, but it is something you can talk about now, and people don't think you're weird for saying it. They don't think you're a luddite or anti-technology for pointing it out.
Yeah, actually, well, you've got teenagers, so can you comment on that?
Yeah, so actually the information has been out for a long time, and it bothers me a little bit
Yeah.
because there's a book that came out in 2016, which means it was written in 2015 or possibly 2014 by a man named Dr. Nicholas Cardaris. It's called Glow Kids.
Mm.
And it's about the addictive nature of screens and that they were made that way on purpose. And I share a statistic just because it always stuck with my mind. Now, it's been years since I've read that book, but in the book, he talks about how screen manufacturers, especially for video games, are making them so they have maximum arousal and addiction.
Mm.
And they are supposed to spike your blood pressure, your galvanic skin response, you're sweating within a few minutes. And if they don't do that, they go back to the drawing board. And the numbers were, I'm pretty sure, 180 over 120. That's the blood
Wow.
pressure spike that they were looking for maximum arousal and addiction. So the information was out. But like you said, Andrew, there was a lot of pushback. Nobody wanted to hear it. And I do think that there are kids who would say, I lost my childhood. I
Yes.
lost the ability to play, and now it's over. And I didn't get that. And I think it matters. I think especially now there is a man named Chris McKenna who I just recently talked with. He has a organization called Protect Young Eyes, and he said we've crossed that point of no return. There's no excuse anymore. Now we know.
Yes.
We know. And so what's been really cool is that I had no idea that simply prioritizing nature time would be a parenting strategy that works as well for infants as it does for toddlers, as it does
Mhm.
for grade schoolers, as it does for teens. And what you have to look forward to if you are a parent of a young child and you're carrying everything, and kids are falling and crying, and you're bandaging and you're wiping tears and you're dealing with boo boos and all of those types of things, is you have so much to look forward to because this just continues to get more and more fun. And what you have in the end is you have a child who is not dependent on a screen to have a
Mm.
good time. You have a child who has a lot of things to talk about. You have a child who has had a lot of experiences, who is imaginative. And so, in terms of preparing kids for adulthood and preparing them for a world that is rapidly changing, it really does not make sense to be the orchestrator of everything. That makes no sense. If you spend your entire childhood being told what to do and being put in adult directed activities from dawn to dusk, how are you supposed to navigate a world that is really changing and changing really fast? So, our teens are so fun. They're so fun. We just went to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and jumped off cliffs into Lake Superior and we hiked, and they're out on the paddle boats and they're playing all the games. They have a depth to them and it's different. It's different because they will even say to me, I'll go talk to kids and they have
Yeah.
nothing to talk about. And someone who talked about this a lot is Kim John Payne, who is, I would say, maybe my favorite parenting author. He wrote a book called Simplicity Parenting. That was my
Mm.
first exposure to him. And I read it probably a decade ago, if not a little bit more, about the scaling down of childhood. But he's actually written a lot more books than that. He has one called Beyond Winning about youth sports culture. He has one about bullying called, it's something about teens and tweens. I can't think of the exact title. Anyway, he has a book called The Soul of Discipline. He's really changed our approach to parenting. But one of the things he said uh, was is that low screen and no screen kids, so either, right?
Mhm.
It doesn't have to be no screen, it can
Yep.
be low screen, are enduringly popular.
Mm.
And his whole point was that you could be a kid that can talk about TikTok, but if that's all you can talk about,
Yep.
and we've been around teens that that's all they can talk about. So and so was following this person and now they're not, and who's following you? And I saw this video. If that's all you can talk about, then the depth can never get there in terms of a deep friendship. And
Yes.
so I am so glad. If I had to do childhood all over again, and we've done this every single year we aim to get outside for 1,000 hours. A couple years we did not hit it, like babies, or we're in the 900s. It doesn't really matter. If you get into 706 hours, it doesn't really matter. And a lot of families get more. I mean, it's halfway through the year; they're already there. We're on the lower scale, really, compared to some of these families. But it has worked and it has given us kids that have this depth to them that's really fun. And now I'm running after them and they're challenging me. And that's something that you talk about in a multi
Mm.
generational way, Andrew and Jill, which is why I love what you're doing with Wild Strong. You talk about how this multi generational thing, like when you're the parent, you got little kids and you're providing them the mud kitchen and that sort of thing. you're really benefiting them. But what happens is the tides turn.
Yeah.
And then they are athletic and they are brave and courageous and they want to do the things. And so you follow. You follow. And then you're the one that's behind, but you're the one who's being challenged to do all sorts of functional movement in nature that's working on your balance and your agility and your coordination and your joy because you're following after your kids.
Yeah, it's so true. I think, could you talk a little bit about if people are kind of looking for ideas of how to get started and how to spend more time outside with their kids? Like what resources do you have, or where would you recommend, if I didn't know where to start, where would you recommend starting?
I would recommend starting, and I'm not sure, everyone's in different locations. I would recommend starting with walking.
Mm.
So that would be a small hike or a walk around your city. And if you could do a half mile or a mile and you go at your child's pace and you bring a friend, I think that the friend is probably one of the most key components because your kids are going to get bored with you. It just is how it is. Our teens, they don't want to do too much outside with us. But if there's a friend coming, they're
Yeah.
always going to want to go. So if you can rope in a friend, all you need is one. You don't need a lot. They don't have to be the same age as your kids, just another person, another couple kids there. So I always recommend walking is easy. If you have a short hike that's near your house, a half mile, a mile, you're stuck out there, kids are going to find something interesting. Nature always provides. I think that's a great start. You can also start by taking your meals out. If that's a possibility where you're at with your weather, can you move your meals outside and enjoy them a little bit more? The sunshine makes a difference with your physiology.
Mhm.
Can you take some of your inside things outside? Could you fold your laundry out there? Could you have a clothesline? And that's going to work on your movement, lifting your arms up. We just talked about this, right? Katie Bowman says you should have your arms extended above your head. Could you put your things on a clothesline? Could you do your schoolwork? Could you read your books? That type of thing. So I start there. I think, my story is one day, 4 hours changed my life. So I think if you have the opportunity to have an extended period of time outdoors in a place that's not maybe a zoo, a place that's like a natural, well, we went and it was just grass, a place that, and had a creek. So there was a water element, but it wasn't like sort of the stressful type of thing where there's a lot of people and you're
Yeah.
having to pay for concessions and
Yeah.
you want to see the giraffe, but it's sleeping and whatever. Do giraffes sleep? Probably they must be asleep. I don't know.
Probably.
Uh, that's kind of a stressful situation. Can you go
Yeah.
to a calm, peaceful nature place and say, we're going to stay for a bit? And what happens is the kids have to pull from their own interior resources. And this Angela Hanscom says it can take kids up to 45 minutes to develop their
Mhm.
play
Yes.
scheme. And that's important to know because there might be at minute 25 where your kid is saying, I'm bored.
Hmm.
What should I be doing? And you're going to have to just muscle through it. You say things like, it's okay to be bored. That's what we say. I trust you'll find something to do and just kind of ad nauseum, repeat, be boring yourself, then they'll go find something to do. But it's important to know that there is a period of time where they're probably going to struggle. We all struggle to be creative at times.
Yeah.
And so you work through it. So if you are working full time, you got two with spouse, you got both are working full time, you've got a child in school. Could you stay when you go pick your child up? Could you bring a snack and stay for 45 minutes or an hour after school before you go home? Could you set aside 9 to 1 on a Saturday and go to a local park, something like that? And I think once you have the experience of how much joy it brings to your family, how much peace, and also to know that this is helping their cognition and all of these things for their growth and development, you realize that it's worth your time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You touched on so many things. I've just been taking all these notes, and there's so many things I want to jump on. But one of the things you said at the beginning that just really resonates with me is you were talking about going to these little 45-minute classes. Taking your kids here, whether it's karate or violin or gymnastics or whatever. And it's one of the things I notice as well is so often those things are a struggle, even if the children actually enjoy it while they're there. Something about the process of going to and from it, and I see it a lot in city kids in big cities where their parents have lots of planned activities for them and going to A and B and C and whatever. Um, and people treat it as if it's the same as play, but it's obviously not the same thing as play because it's parent directed, it's top down. And I think you're right. I think giving kids just that time to come up with their play scheme and giving them time to set up their own rules, I've just found is so important. And you see, like, in one of the books I recently read, they had a phrase which is "play begets play," which is the more you play, the better you get at like learning how to play and seeing the opportunities for play.
What book was that?
Um, and I just think you're right. I think there's something about giving people the time just to be in that space being outside that is so much more meaningful.
I think they do that well. They have in the UK, and they maybe have similar in the US, but they have these adventure playgrounds which were set up, I'm going to say about 13 years ago, but I might be wrong.
Ooh, maybe even older.
Maybe even
Yeah, I'm
older.
gonna say older.
I'll go back and read that up. But
Yeah.
anyway, they were set up a while ago, and they tend to be quite large green spaces, and the adult to child ratio is. And again, I've probably misremembered this, but it was when I first heard it, I was like, wow, it's incredible. You have to drop your kids off. You're not allowed to go in with them. And I think it was something like 120 children to something around like 4 or 5 adults. And they have like bits where you can climb. They've got like a whole kind of tool station. I think they've got a fire.
Yeah, they often have
Like there's
fires,
just a whole load of risks.
sharp things, high things,
And
heavy things.
amazingly, they managed to keep. So we had a really strict lockdown in the UK, and in the ones in London, they campaigned to keep them open for the second lockdown. They had to close them for the first lockdown, kept them open for the second lockdown. And it meant that these kids who normally had access to, they only had a balcony, they had the park, but they didn't have their own green space. Those kids that really needed it maintained access to like 4 to 5 acres of green space in London where they could just do free play like for hours. And it's the reading the studies that came off that, it's a really incredible thing. I don't know if there's a similar movement in the US, but I was also thinking, I'm going to jump on the thing about doing things with a friend.
Yes.
Particularly when you've had your kids, it's kind of lonely sometimes, and like you're really tired and you feel like you sort of definitely failing every day because there's somebody around you who always looks like they remembered how to get dressed. Or like just they look like they're sort of so well put together, and you're just sort of barely getting out of your pajamas to like go outside with your children. But there's a really lovely group that started again off the back of lockdown in the UK called Blaze Trails, and they do like parent and guardian and toddler like walking groups, and they'll do really little walks around a city, or they'll do kind of slightly bigger walks, but it's like bring your kids, you can bring them in a stroller, you can bring them like carrying them, it doesn't really matter what stage they're at, but just come along. And the connections that they found and they've built through that, I think it's been really lovely, because I think more and more people don't have the money and the resources to keep going to all of these classes.
Yeah, they get so expensive.
But then you have that kind of stress where you're like, well, maybe I should be learning jiu-jitsu at age 4.
You have that fear of keeping up, again, that pressure of the parenting.
It is nice if you can find 1 or 2 other people to kind of go outside with and connect with nature.
Well, I wanted to say, what you're saying about the walking. It's funny because we say that a lot with if they want to start up a new Wild Strong, and say, well, how do we start? It's like, honestly, you just start going on walks with people in the woods, and then just realizing that you're allowed to climb a tree or try jumping over a creek and things like that. And there's something really magical about that. What we found, we've been doing the litter pickups recently.
Yeah, that's been good for our like outdoor time, multi-generational.
Yeah, and the litter pickups are great because it gives people a purpose. And some people are afraid to feel like they're making time for themselves. Do you know what I mean? Especially, I think sometimes moms, they feel sometimes they feel bad making time for themselves. So it's almost like if you can kind of sneak in a sort of productivity, and I think people feel good about picking up the litter. But those are great because the parents will go and we'll sort of pick up the litter along the beach, and then the kids they just kind of create their own sort of nomadic band, and they just sort of play. And over the course of 2 or 3 hours over the walk, maybe they pick up some litter, but they're just playing up by the beach, picking up rocks, trying to catch fish and crabs and things like that. But there is something really nice about the walking that I think is really magical. We in Scotland, they have something called Right to Roam.
Yeah.
And in Scotland, you pretty much have access to walk any green space you want. You don't come upon like these giant ranches that you're not allowed to walk on. There's no walking signs, things like that. And it's funny because last time we were in the States, we were in Florida, where my parents live, and you sometimes you feel like you don't have opportunities to interact with the world around you. You feel like everything is transactional. You feel like the only way you can go outside is by paying to go to a zoo, or is by paying to go to a theme park or something like that.
Yeah, that was my next question, is around the different. Can you talk a bit about? I don't know if the difference maybe between sort of UK and US and sort of access to nature, I guess, and like how you can do it on a different.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest questions people have is sometimes people feel like they don't have access to green space. I was wondering how you talk to people when they say, "Oh, that sounds great," but where do I go on a walk, or like where do I find nature?
Well, Scott Sampson says nature's everywhere coming up between the cracks in the sidewalk. So I've always loved that one. That's from he had a show called Animal Train or Dinosaur, not Animal Train, Dinosaur Train on
Well,
PBS.
we watch Dinosaur Train. We're
Yeah.
big
So he
fans.
has a book
Good
called
songs.
it's a good book. It's called How to Raise a Wild Child. That one's been out for quite a while too. But I agree with that. I mean, I think nature is everywhere. And the way that I address that, because people do ask that every single time, they ask, "Oh, what if you live here or there?" And what's interesting is there's a man named Dan Buettner who has studied what are called the blue zones, and he's has a documentary. He has a lot of books out, and it's really interesting. The blue zones are what he's dubbed these places where people tend to live to be into their hundreds, centenarians. And one of his top tips, if you're interested in becoming a centenarian, which I would imagine a lot of us are,
Yeah.
is to live in a walkable city.
Yes.
And so actually he's touting that city life as one of the top things that you could choose to do. Whereas I think a lot of people are kind of like, well, how can you get outside if you live in the city? And he's basically saying, no, this is a great thing. So what I've always said is, you've got three options, right? You're either living in the city, or you're living in a suburb, or you're living in the country. And each one offers pros and each one offers cons. So if you're in the city, it's a walkable place. So the recommendation would be walk as much as you can. Can you walk and get your groceries? Can you walk to the library? Can you walk to school? Can you choose to walk? Can you walk? And I've got a brother that lives in Brooklyn, New York, and we've gone and visited. We've done so many things outdoors there. In fact, that was mostly what we did was
Yeah.
outdoors. And we had a baby and we're carrying him on the back. And, we went to see the Statue of Liberty and we went to the zoo, we went to the park. There was all sorts of playgrounds. So if you're in a walkable city, walk. That would be my suggestion. Find a friend who will walk with you. You're always safer in numbers, extra eyes, especially if you have young kids. If you're in a suburb, now you're out of this situation where you don't have the walkable city and you don't really have the country,
Yeah.
but you have neighbors. And really the biggest thing about kidding kids outside is friends. And there's a book called Playborhood by a man named Mike Lanza, and he talks about making your front yard a very attractive space to draw kids in, because he says that the video games are always going to offer enjoyment for a child, but when they look outside and don't see anyone else playing or anything
Yeah.
to do, they're not enticed to be out there. So if you're in a suburb and you have a bunch of houses around you, that's a gift, and you could try and insert different things that would help your neighborhood kids get out and play and romp around together. Additionally, Katie Bowman suggests, if you live in a suburb, that when you drive, you don't drive the whole way. So, can you
Mm.
You
drive
drive a
part of
bit.
the way to school and walk the rest? Can you drive part of the way to the grocery store and walk the rest and carry your groceries? That type of thing. If you're in the country, and this is, I think, what people idealize, they idealize the country living. You've got some space, you've got some land. There's no kids. That's the downside. There's
Yeah.
no one for anyone to play with. And kids in on their own are not necessarily enticed out there unless there's someone to play with. And so what you're having to do in that situation often is you're having to invite people out. So there's no perfect thing. There's pros and cons to all of it. And I think what's fun is if you're able to, here and there, pop to the different ones. Can you go to someone's neighborhood and let the kids play with the neighbor kids if you live in the country? If you're in the city, can you get out to the country sometimes? In Florida, there are so many. Florida has the most springs, natural springs of
Yeah.
any state in America. And there's this one that we go to on a yearly basis. It's called Madison Blue Spring State Park. It's right off the main highway if you're coming into Florida from the north, and everybody comes into Florida mostly from the north. And it's 15 minutes off the highway, and it's considered America's best swimming hole. No one's ever heard of it. It's stunningly beautiful, and there are springs. There is a spring in this city called Apopka in Florida that you put a tube in and you ride it around. It's like a natural lazy river. And then it gets you to the front, and there's otters swimming in there, and there's a beach area, and you can camp. And then there's a spring that's like this hugest pool you've ever seen. You swim from one side to the other, you're floating, and there's a restaurant there where your table is like you make pancakes on it. It's called the
Yeah.
Old Spanish Sugar Mill, and the spring is called De Leon Springs. I mean, there are so many fun things to do. So in the states, there are county parks, there are state parks, there are national parks, and there are school playgrounds that are open outside of school hours to the public. And that's a fun thing to do too. If I think one of the best ideas if your kids are in school is when they get out at 4 o'clock, don't come home. let them play. Let them like decompress. Bring some
Mm.
good snacks. Make sure another family or two stays with you. You could playground hop. Go to the neighborhood school. They're not used to that playground, and that's a new place for them. So there's a lot of options. There's more things to do than we ever could have time for.
That's a good way of putting it. I think we've got some good lists for when we next go to Florida.
Yeah, yeah.
I had a question for you about, so we don't have teenagers yet, but my niece and my nephews are, coming into that zone.
Yeah.
Uh, and I guess they are mostly brought up in the city. And I think um, it's kind of interesting watching them. It's a really hard time, that
Yeah.
teenage time, like we all remember it. And they're kind of half human, half teenager at this this point in time. And I wonder if there's ways that you can kind of help them connect with nature that doesn't, that you found successful, or anything that you've read around kind of resources for parents of teenagers.
I think freedom is a big deal. Freedom is a big deal. Do you remember being a teenager? It's like you feel like you're really close to being an adult. And we were in a situation the other day where our kids were at this short program, and they weren't allowed to chew gum. And the person who was leading the program was an adult, and they were chewing gum. And it was like,
Mm.
"Why are you chewing gum?" And it was like this big thing, like we're adults and we get to
Yeah.
make our own rules. And I was like, well, these kids are like a year and a half from being an adult. It's like not there's not
Yeah.
this huge distinction. Like you're really close. And
Mm.
one of the things that really changed me, and actually is a kind of a two in one, because I'm a big fan of Dr. Peter Gray. And actually, he uses the word self structured play, which is probably one of my favorite things because we talk about adult directed, adult structured, and then the opposite of that, I think for most people they've called it unstructured play. But
Mm.
he says no, all play has structure. It's
Yeah.
just that the child structures it. It's self-structured. So I love that he uses that. But he has this story at the end of his book called Free to Learn, where he talks about how his son went to Europe from the States on his own, and he really wanted to go. He was interested in some different things. He wants to go to Europe. He wants to see these different sites. And he starts talking to his parents. Like, I really would like to go to Europe. I'm interested in these like Dungeons and Dragons type thing. And he said, I'll work. This is in the 80s. So no
Yeah.
internet, no
Yeah.
Google, right? I'm going to work. I'm going to save the money and I'll buy my ticket and I'll figure it all out. And can I go? And Dr. Peter Gray, we've talked about this story where he said, we were really on edge because he's a type 1 diabetic. So that
Mm.
was like the biggest thing that we were worried about. But in the end, they ended up letting him go to Europe for 2 weeks. And he was 13
Wow. Wow.
by
Wow.
himself. No internet, no cell phone. And so what that means is that he was earning the money when he was 12. So he had a job, and they dropped him off at the airport at age 13, and he went to Europe and he made two calls home during the time and made it back home.
Just
And so
sorted it out.
when I read that story, I thought, I am too overprotective. I do not need to know where my kids are at all
Yeah.
times. They can walk the neighborhood when they're 9, 10, 11 without me having to have some, tracking device on them. I think when I get into those spots of feeling fretful, which we do, I really lean on that story. I mean, obviously, no one would do that now. No one. Are you kidding me? Can you imagine if you were like, yeah, my 12-year-old's working at the local diner because next
Yeah.
year he's
There's
going to go to wherever by himself with no cell phone. And he was fine. And so I think that kids need to be trusted and feel trusted. And Lenore Skenazy talks about that too in her book of Free
Yeah.
Range Kids. I think like that's the point is that, kids, they grow into that. And so they
Yes.
should have a lot of freedom. They're so close to being adults.
So actually, it's more a question about how you can find ways as a parent to not panic. Like when you have, because actually that's the barrier, isn't it? Like for us, we live rurally and we're very lucky we have access to a huge amount of green space, and our kids roam it pretty, like they go to the village school. There's a main road that goes straight through the village. It's pretty fast, but other than that, there's not. If they're on this side of the road, there's a lot of space, and they just go to the woods, and we send them off, and that's fine. But I often find it's actually me having to sort of suppress my panic voice and then I'll go and check on them, and obviously they're fine, they're all up a tree. But it, I wonder what the tools are for the parents to sort of how, there are more cars on the road, right, than there were when we were kids, and they move a lot faster, and so that is a major concern where we are from a lot of parents, is actually the cars on the roads are just much busier. Um, so that I think is the main barrier. But I wonder, do you have any sort of tips for?
Yes, I've got an idea for you, and an idea for your listeners. There is, oh, I can't remember his name. I think his name is Christopher Chin. I'm pretty sure he's an adventure photographer, and he has this master class. So there's that master class app where you can go and learn all these things from
Sure.
masters. And he's an adventure photographer. And forgive me if I mispronounced his name. But he's on there, and I watched him. He's an adventure photographer in the sense that, like, he's doing photography while he's skiing down mountains and
Wow.
all of these things that are very adventurous. And he's taking photos while he's doing it, and he's going on these huge expeditions
Yeah.
expeditions to these remote places so he can get this cool photography for these different companies. And in that masterclass, he gave a formula for risk. And I thought, this is really valuable. So the formula is risk is a combination of two things that usually you sort of figure out very quickly. Your mind just does it automatically. But it's a combination of how dangerous is something in combination with how likely it is to happen. And I thought that's probably one of the most valuable equations to know as a parent, because that we have to think rationally about things. So, if you have a 3-year-old and you live near a busy road, how dangerous is that? It's very dangerous. That's a catastrophically dangerous situation. And how likely is it for something to happen? Very. If your child, though, is 13 and you live near a busy road, how dangerous is it? It's still pretty dangerous. If you get hit by a fast moving car, that's very dangerous. But how likely is it to happen? It's a
Mm.
lot less for a teenager. They're pretty, they can figure out, they can run across the street. They can look, they have their wits about them. And so you can look at the different situations, I think, in that lens with that equation, because what it helps you to do, I think, is it helps you to realize, like, this is not really that risky. What's the biggest thing? You talk about the forest by you. What's the really biggest thing that could happen? They could break an arm. That's
Yeah.
not that risky. They could twist an ankle. That's really not that risky. And that's worth it, because the only way we learn to be in our bodies is if we use them. It's actually riskier to avoid risk.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
riskier because then we
Mm.
don't know what we can do. We don't have confidence. We can't trust
Yep.
ourselves. How are we supposed to go out into the world? I had this conversation with a woman named Dr. Jean Twangy, and she's a
Yeah.
generational change expert. She wrote a book called iGen, which is one of my favorites, internet generation, she calls them. And she was telling me that in her college classes, the kids are coming to college and they're not able to make simple decisions without texting their parents.
Mm.
I mean, that's not great. That's
Yep.
that's really not what we want. And so I feel that what happens is the risk calculation
Yep.
slowly throughout childhood gets transferred from the parent to the child. And while you're doing that, you're both increasing your capacity to trust. The child is increasing their capacity to trust themselves, and the parent is increasing their capacity to trust their child, because at some point they're going to be gone. And you have to be ready for that. Our oldest started driving this year,
Wow.
and I feel fine about it. Fine. Totally fine. He's responsible. He's done all sorts of things in his life, and he's a great driver. We did all of the training, and off he goes. And we don't have any tracking device on him or anything like that. And what's happened is we have had a decade plus, 10,000 plus hours of passing the baton of trust from
Yep.
parent to child.
Wow. Super interesting. I wondered if you know about that. If you've seen that image, it was part of a what was the study by William Bird on it tracks generations of a family
Oh.
and the amount of freedom that the 9-year-old children were allowed, and so it goes back to sort of 1910 with the
Yeah,
grandfather.
you've seen the radius. They would have had access to something like 9 miles, like essentially as far as you could walk in a
He
day.
could walk 9 miles down to a stream, go fishing, come back without a parent, and then it tracks his child and then their child, and it's super.
You just see this contracting radius.
When you look at the way that they map it, it's every time I see it, I probably look at it about once a year, and it really shocks me.
Yeah.
I'll share it with you.
Eugene
Well,
Minot
it's
talks
on your
about it.
website. I think I had
Oh, is
notes
it?
from it because I was on your
Oh, there we
website
go.
earlier.
It's
Yeah, this was on your website. You have a blog post called Watching Over Children Less, And it
Oh,
said
very nice.
Oh yeah.
an 8-year-old in 1919 walked 6 miles on their own to go fishing. An 8-year-old in 2017 walks 300 yards on their own.
Yeah, there we
6
go.
miles to 300 yards.
It's pretty stark.
Yeah.
Completely forgotten I'd written that blog, so thanks, Ginny.
But you know, you're exactly right. Kids grow into the space that you give them. You know, and one of the things, you know, we try to be quite hands off. You know, high trusting, giving our kids opportunities to make their own decisions. And what you find is that kids calibrate that. You know, the kids who do have the opportunity to play around with risk, I'd say neither, like, we've given our kids loads of freedom, and neither one of them are like particularly wild, but they will jump off things. But you know, they kind of think about it and they decide whether or not they want to do it because it's something that they've grown up with. And then you will see kids who sometimes their first time out, you know, you're like, oh, is that a good decision? And like, you know, sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. But there is something to be said about giving them that space. And I like Twangy's work as well. And it's one of the things I think about is like, our how much are we holding back kids at a societal level? You know, even this idea of teenagers, which I think is healthy, but is also a relatively new concept because you think about, you know, how kids would have grown up watching their parents work in, you know, pre-industrial societies, and this idea that kids are sort of compartmentalized and they spend most of their life in an institutional setting that's essentially designed to train them to get ready for another institutional setting, as opposed to just kind of having the free reign. Like, one of the things I found is my kids just love watching me do like work. Like, and sometimes it's a bit annoying because I'm trying to fix something. And it's not even annoying. It's just that sometimes I'm trying to fix something. Or I'm working on a bicycle, and all of a sudden it becomes the most important thing in the world. Like, they'll stop whatever they're doing because they want to be a part of it. Kids have this love of just like tactile information, and then you see it when you're on a screen or if I'm doing computer work, how because so little of what we do of the modern workplace is embodied or is tactile. It's sort of, you know, it's kind of intellectual work that all happens in this virtual reality, and kids just sort of like, they don't even recognize that you're doing something, you know.
Yeah, because it's so abstract.
It's so abstract, but I'm always amazed that if you just gave kids like a workshop with tools and just had them fix things all day, I feel like 50-60% of kids would just absolutely love that. You know, kids just love problem solving. I think it's one of the reasons why so many kids don't like school, is because they get the impression that it's make work rather than solving real problems that need to be fixed. You know, if you're all working on the same 10 math problems that just got spat out in a Xerox machine, that's not nearly the same thing as trying to solve a problem that actually uses math.
I'm
I
going to
mean, I'm right
skip.
there with you. One of my favorite books is one of my
Um,
favorite books in that vein is called Learning All the Time by John Holt. It's a small one. It's a short book. It's a quick read, and it's definitely not a read that if you're in the institution to institution path that you're going to probably love. But if you're contemplating some of these things, one of the things that John Holt said, and he's long past, so this book is,
Yep.
I'm not sure if it's from the 80s or something like that. But what he says is kids need some sense by which, a project is done. Like, they need to know how do you make a table from start to finish, and
Yes.
they need to be drawn in small doses at higher and higher levels into the adult world so that they know
Yes.
how the adult world works, instead of being in a situation where someone is constantly telling them everything that they're
Hmm.
supposed to do. And I was in the public school setting for quite a while, and I had fun there. You and I talked about, because we did a podcast together earlier this morning, we were talking about you can incorporate games, you can make things fun, and I did really enjoy that. But there was a time when I was substitute teaching, and I was with a bunch of 5-year-olds, so in the kindergarten class, and the substitute plans were drawn out minute by minute, and obviously
Yep.
that was meant to help the substitute teacher so that things don't devolve into chaos. But it was like, 8:50 to 8:54, read this book, and 8:54 to 8:59, sing this song, and 8:59. And it was one of those things that's like, the students are not privy to any of the behind the scenes. Like, why from
Yep.
8:54 to 8:59 are we doing that? They just do it. And so I think there's something to be said about exposing children to real world things, to adult work, to things outside of that sort of conveyor belt type.
Yeah.
Here's your second grade stuff. Let me put it in your brain and let me move you on to the third grade. I think that there's a richness and a depth there that we're missing if that's all we do.
Yeah,
Yep.
I agree. I've got a question about nature connection. Something that we've noticed with our eldest loves just loves categorizing things.
Yeah.
And his brain just really works in like a very sort of earnest categorizing way. And the way that that manifests now he's at school is that we're kind of low screen. I guess they watch a bit of telly. We have no computer games, and we're trying to keep it like that. Um, but I mean, they'll watch some TV occasionally. But the way that our eldest, his categorizing brain, he's at school, and they have a common language of what you're playing on. What is it? Zelda.
Yeah,
On
there's
like the
also a
sort of
thing. Well, yeah,
different
what are you
community,
playing
like
on the newest
he's just
Nintendo? Yeah.
completely memorized all of the different, like, I mean, because I don't play this game, I don't really know what I'm talking about, but all the different levels of Zelda, the people in Zelda, and then everything in the Marvel universe. And it's sort of like, wow, you don't play computer games in our household, and yet
You've never seen a Marvel movie, as
you've
far as
never
I know.
seen a Marvel movie, and yet you've completely memorized all of this stuff, which is obviously very important for you because
Yes.
you're 7 and you're at primary school, and that's what you're talking to with your peers. But what is it about your brain? And I know that that brain is very similar to a lot of other kids his age. Like previously, you would have used that categorization brain for understanding how nature works,
Learning
or
about
like,
plants. Yeah.
yeah. And I wonder, do you have any sort of I guess things around nature connection or tools around nature connection that can help parents kind of teach their kids about what's happening in the natural world? Because to me, that's much more useful and interesting than what Marvel are trying to sell us next month.
Yeah, isn't that an interesting thing? Because our brains are meant to be that way, and nature has all of these little nuances. And what
Yeah.
does the milkweed look like? And what does the maple leaf look like? And what are the small differences? We actually do have a whole curriculum. It's called Add the Wonder, and it's a cross curriculum. We have about 30 unit studies that you can do with your whole family based around nature topics. So, like seeds or sunflowers or whatever is interesting to you, animal homes, animal tracks, scat, all of these different things that could be interesting to you. And you learn what's interesting about nature study is that you learn about the study of a lot of things through the topic of whatever interests you. So if your child is interested in butterflies or if they're interested in rabbits, you can learn about all of the subjects in a cohesive way. And so I do love that style of learning because it helps the learning stick and you can do it
Mm.
across all ages. And what really got us into that was in our area, the butterfly. So the monarch butterflies in our area, they lay their eggs on the underside of a milkweed leaf. And so
Mm.
you're learning what does the milkweed look like if it's everywhere and it's pretty easy to find. It's got its own distinct look and it's like hide and seek. So you're going to go look and you're looking under all the leaves and you're trying to find caterpillars and you're trying to find the eggs. And what happens is then the eggs grow 2,000 times their size once they hatch until they're this caterpillar. And then the caterpillar forms a J shape. I mean, look at all the things that you're learning, right? It forms
Yeah.
a J shape. And then it sheds its final skin and it becomes a chrysalis. And the kids are learning science and they're learning math because they're learning about how big it grows and they're learning to notice things. And then in 2 weeks out hatches a butterfly and depending on the hormones, you can tell if it's a male butterfly or a female butterfly. Anyway, where we live in Michigan, those butterflies fly to Mexico. So here we're learning geography and there's several generations and you can actually tag, you can put a little sticker. They have this whole program where you can tag your butterfly and follow its journey. So, I mean, it's just an interesting thing. Like any subject that your kid because kids are like that, aren't they, Jill? They're
Yeah.
fascinated. What are they fascinated with? I mean, they're all different things. I had a kid that really liked rocks, and a kid that wants to do a garden, and a kid that likes, this one likes to grow pumpkins. Whatever it is, nature facilitates because there's so much variety out there, and there's just like this never ending rabbit hole of things that you can learn.
That's great. So if people want to get hold of that curriculum, they can go on to your
Our
website.
website, yeah, it's called 1000hoursoutside.com, and we've got curriculum in our shop. They're fantastic. You can either buy them in we have them printed, but you can just get digital forms too, and they're really fun. Like we have one about clouds, and the kids are learning for all the different names, and they're drawing pictures. It's really fun.
Oh, great. And do you have any resources for schools as well? Or is it
It
if
would work
we
great for schools. And nature schools have used it. It would also work. And because they're multi-age, so those type of resources, we have a resource pack that we have for schools that some have used. There's a school near us that did 1,000 hours outside. The whole school did, but it was an outdoor school, so it worked out a little bit better. And they had a 1,000 hours outside day, and they celebrated that. I think any resource that reminds teachers that getting kids outside is great for their development is important because you can take a lot of your lessons outside.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we just need to get more waterproofs in the UK because we seem to be destined for wetter
Yeah.
winters. Have you got anything else? I was going to.
I mean, I've got a lot of things I could talk about, but I feel like that's probably a good place to stop. I mean, I'm a big fan of John Holt, and I really like some of the writers who were writing in the '70s, like Ivan Illich and stuff like that, because I think they did such a good job talking about dangers of institutionalization and things like that. And I think in a lot of ways, it's really interesting to read the writers from the 1970s because they were able to see things with a clarity that we can't see now because we're sort of stuck in the system in the belly of the beast. But I think that's a conversation for another day. But I would definitely like to pick your brain on some of that in another context.
Yeah, they talk about the sort of biodiversity learning as well. So you only know what you were brought up with, and so the sort of lack of biodiversity that we have now just feels normal to us.
Yeah, there's just so much now that's sort of become invisible. There's so much that we live in now. It's the water that we swim in.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
and
another author that I love that's in like if I probably is from the 70s is Neil Postman. Have you read much of his
yeah,
stuff?
yeah, yeah. I
And
I
he has a
just
book called I think it's called Entertaining Ourselves to Death.
entertaining ourselves to death,
That's
and
not probably
then
the exact title.
technopoly, which is very good,
Technically,
which
yeah.
ties in a lot. I was thinking when you were talking about,
It's Amusing Ourselves to Death is the name of
yeah,
the book.
uh, yeah, and well, I mean that's a great example because he talks about how insidious television and cable television is. And people will sometimes talk about Neil Postman. They'll say, "Oh, well, it's so funny because he thought television was this horrible force, and it was gonna, do all these horrible things to our imagination and our health and our mental health. And look at us, we're fine." I'm like, "No, he was he was
He
right.
was
He was
totally
right." But now
right.
we have the internet
And you
too.
just take everything he said and you just kind of like apply it to the internet. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
fascinating.
even more
He's like
so.
a
And his book,
philosopher. Yeah. They're
sorry.
philosophers about technology, they're philosophers about education. And I think they have good thoughts that, um, you would love to hear what they would have to say today. I think they would be
Yeah.
horrified.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think so. I was thinking of Marshall McLuhan when Jill was talking about our eldest son. It's so interesting because he doesn't watch the movies, he doesn't play the games, but he still has to be conversant in all this because it's so important. And McLuhan used to make this point. He's like, if you try to abstain from media, from watching television, everything like that, you're just as beholden to everything everyone else is, but you also don't have the firsthand knowledge of what it is. So if you decide that you're not going to watch television and you're not going to read the news or whatever, which I think that makes a lot of sense, you're still living in that environment where everyone else is making decisions and talking about that stuff anyway. So it's that balance. Is it worth seeing it firsthand and then deciding what you want to take and not take? And it's complicated. And that's one of the things that we're sort of not worried about. But as we get older, how do you navigate that with the smartphones and everything as the kids get older? Because is it fair to impose um, this sort of lifestyle on them? And I'm obviously not convinced that giving kids a tablet when they're young in any way is going to help them learn or explore. I think that all that idea of becoming computer savvy is completely overstated. I mean, I think you talked about this recently on your podcast, but like iPads aren't going anywhere. But childhood is this finite window. Um, yeah, but I mean, it is. It's just so complicated, and I do love going back to some of the old authors because I think they do see things with this sort of clarity that is sometimes hard for us to make sense of.
And I
Yeah.
think that what our job is to be the next iteration of it. There has
Yeah,
to be someone out there who is saying the things that Neil Postman said about television,
yeah,
about about the internet and about smartphones for kids. And people are taking that up, but it's slow and it's coming. And I think what you guys are doing, which is building community, is so important because if you can find a small community of people who don't watch Marvel, then your kid is going to be fine. They don't have to, they don't
yeah.
have to grapple with that, and
Well,
they don't have to deal with that. And I think the question of is it fair is an empathetic one. I think it's a good one to ask for sure.
and I think you hit the nail on the head. It's sort of about having the community and finding the community of people who support that, so you don't feel like you're the odd family out. I know Jill has to go.
And
So
thank you so
yeah.
much, Ginny.
Well, do you want to head out, or do you want to?
No, I was just going to say
Yeah.
that it would be good. What I'll do after recording this is add in some of the authors and the links that we were talking
Awesome.
about, because I think
Great.
anyone that listens to this will be super interested in all of those resources. We've just created a whole reading list,
Yeah.
and I'll put in links to your resources as well on the 1000 Hours website. Thank you so much for coming on. It was great speaking to you, and just keep doing what you're
Yeah,
doing.
what a treat. And you guys are doing amazing work. And huge congrats again on your podcast. I think that's so exciting.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was really great having you. Just a real wealth of resources. I've taken, I think, I've got 23 pages of notes I've taken on this little
That's so
thing.
I took a
Uh,
bunch too, though, Andrea. I said Andrea. Andrew,
yeah,
I feel like that you guys are clearly big readers and deep thinkers, and I don't usually come away from episodes with a whole list for myself. So I'm really excited about that.
Day, night. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
I hope you enjoyed that. I find that really interesting. Ginny Yurich is definitely someone to follow. She's also got a fantastic podcast where she interviews a lot of really interesting people around the ideas of nature connection, getting outside with your kids. There's some really good ones on there. I think she's interviewed Peter Gray a few times, who writes so brilliantly about children and play and risk, and letting them have access to risk so that they can kind of understand how to navigate their way through the world. Next up we have me and Andrew talking about older populations and the fear of falling cycle, and how much that can kind of dominate your life as you get a bit older. We've been working a lot recently with people in their 60s, 70s and 80s, and it's been constantly a real eye-opener for us, and has kind of forced us to completely rethink how we teach movement, and really shifting about as far away as you possibly can from the idea of exercise and an exercise class. Actually, ultimately, you just want to get people outside having a nice time, playing some games and having a chat, because actually at that point you're just kind of letting them think about how they could maybe regain a bit of access to movements that they've lost or that they're worried about, but also you're just allowing them time with friends to have a nice time and be outside. And then we finish with a cup of tea, which I think is almost as important as attending the class, to be honest. So that's coming up next week, and then after that we've got a few more guests, and hoping that we've got a little bit of backlog on editing to do, but there's some really interesting ones coming up around strength training, more on strength training, around play. We've got some behaviour change experts coming on to talk about our relationship with physical activity and what can kind of make habits stick. Just some good stuff. Anyway, I hope you'll be back, and we will see you very soon. Goodbye.